Hello friends. In September of 2007, I took the trip of a lifetime to what must be the strangest and most closed country on earth, North Korea. I accompanied 20 of my fellow American citizens on a 4-day, 4-night stay, and over the next few minutes, as we approach the 10-year anniversary of my trip, and political tensions at the moment are at an all-time high as we sit here in August of 2017, I will share many of the photos that I took in the DPRK. But first, a disclaimer on my photos. While I was in Beijing awaiting my departure to Pyongyang, I managed to do a significant amount of water damage to my primary camera lens, which rendered the majority of the photos I took in North Korea simply unusable. And even the usable photos have this sort of hazy quality that you'll see. And another thing you may be wondering, why would you even go to North Korea in the first place? At the time, it was estimated that only 500 American citizens had ever even set foot in North Korea. And of course, a disproportionate number of them had been imprisoned, including a number of high-profile cases that we've seen as of late. Plus, the United States is technically in a state of perpetual war with the DPRK. There was a sort of fragile armistice that was signed at the end of the Korean War, but a formal peace treaty was never drawn up, and both sides as a result have participated in a sort of never-ending border standoff in the DMZ, demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea. And the DPRK is perhaps the most true-to-life realization of the kind of dystopian fantasy that was depicted in George Orwell's 1984. So why did I go? I went to North Korea because I wanted to catch a glimpse of the last gasping vestige of the axis of communist powers that our Western civilization spent so many decades during my childhood, and in fact, many thousands of lives spent to defeat. This is the sort of socialist anti-paradise that once characterized countries like China and Vietnam, but those countries have since long embraced capitalist and semi-democratic reforms. I believe that the road to reunification of the Koreas and positive reforms is paved by engagement, by dialogue. Now, of course, following the death in 2017 of American tourist Otto Warmbier, Americans are now prohibited by the U.S. government from entering North Korea. But today, we'll all experience the country through my photos. Now, it is not possible to visit North Korea without a visa, and the United States and many other Western powers do not maintain diplomatic relations with the DPRK, which means there is no North Korean embassy in the United States, there's no North Korean embassy in many Western countries. So a visa is only obtainable once you reach Beijing, which is the point of embarkation for the majority of tours to North Korea. And so it was there in September of 2007 that I joined 20 Americans for the tour to end all tours. The state-run airline, which is called Air Koryo, runs the only air service, and it shuttles tourists and diplomats between Beijing and the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, in Soviet-era Russian aircraft that must be many, many decades old. In many ways, Air Koryo is like any other airline. You have fasten seatbelt signs, the in-flight meals are lousy, but when you disembark onto that tarmac in Pyongyang, it's like stepping foot on another planet. Tours in North Korea are highly orchestrated, they're highly choreographed. Tourists are not permitted to leave their hotels without being accompanied by 2 government minders. And our tour group consisted of 20 or fewer US citizens. And while in Pyongyang, we were housed in the Yanggakdo Hotel, which is a 4-star, or at least North Korean version of a 4-star, high-rise hotel located on an island in the middle of the Taedong River. The hotel rooms are certainly a bit Spartan, and they've received a great deal of publicity and flack on social networking sites like Yelp and TripAdvisor, but in many ways they're much like any other. They have a television set, which is restricted to only the country's 3 state propaganda networks. They have a bathroom with a shower and bath amenities, and there's even a relatively nice view of the city. I would rise each morning to eat breakfast at the revolving restaurant, which sits on the top floor of the hotel, and it offers truly breathtaking views of the city below, which is often shrouded in the fog of morning. Pyongyang is North Korea's capital, and it is truly a showcase capital in the communist tradition. And it offers a chance for the ruling family, the Kims, to maintain the appearance of prosperity, which they do for purposes of both external and internal propaganda. And it's also a playground for the elite 1%. But when you look past all of the propaganda, Pyongyang also teems with everyday life. And in 2007, the city was just on the cusp of many of the small yet quite significant changes that have taken hold since and have brought a certain modern feel to the city. But back then, Pyongyang was much as it had been for many decades. It was carless, desolate, and dreary. Our group visited a number of sites in Pyongyang, the same standard ones that are included in any foreign tourist itinerary. Let's look at a few of these sites. One of the first stops for most foreign tourists in North Korea is the Mansu Hill Grand Monument, which today features bronze statues of both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the great leader and the dear leader as they're called, but which at the time, in 2007, saw only the image of Kim Il-sung because, of course, Kim Jong-il was still alive at the time. And Kim's statue is flanked by 2 long monuments that depict the struggles of the Korean people against the Japanese, of course in the name of eternal socialism. All North Koreans and visitors are obligated to bow in unison to this towering statue. Refusal to do so would undoubtedly result in imprisonment or expulsion from the country. The Arch of Triumph. This was built to commemorate Korea's independence from Japan in 1945. Japan was, of course, conquered by the Allied powers in World War II, which freed Korea from Japanese rule. And naturally, the decisive American role in Korea's independence is minimized, or in fact non-existent, in favor of the resistance movement of the Korean people. Then there was the Children's Palace, which houses after-school activities for North Korean youth. We arrived late in the afternoon. It was just as school was letting out, and we witnessed the arrival of a gaggle of Pyongyang's tiny elite. We were then treated to an incredible children's artistic performance, which included an amazing xylophone recital which I posted to YouTube some years ago, and it received many thousands of views. I suppose a cynic would say that these children are tools of a communist propaganda machine, and they're probably right. But it was nonetheless admittedly quite entertaining. As we departed, hundreds of North Korean school children gathered as dusk arrived. We also saw the Kumsusan Memorial Palace, and that's a mausoleum that displays the remains of the embalmed body of the late Kim Il-sung, which we were allowed to observe, but we couldn't take photos. Seeing the great leader is actually a rare privilege for the average North Korean, and there were indeed quite a few North Koreans on this day lined up, awaiting their chance for a glimpse of the deified founder of their nation. Manyongdae is the supposed birthplace of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung being the godlike figure that North Koreans worship to this day, and around which a cult of personality of sorts was established and fostered after his installment by the Soviet Union following the division of Korea into North and South along the 30th parallel in 1948 following the end of World War II. But today, every day North Koreans file by in Manyongdae. They lay flowers at the foot of the cottage with the thatched roof where the DPR government claims that the elder Kim was raised. And that day, a group of locals who were clad in traditional dress stopped for a family portrait. The Pyongyang Metro doubles as both a system of transportation and a bomb shelter, and the metro is supposedly ridden by hundreds of thousands of North Koreans each day. After you descend to the depth of a football field down what is a stunningly long escalator, you discover original stations that are quite ornately appointed with gaudy chandeliers and communist propaganda frescoes painted on the walls and on the columns. We also visited the Grand People's Study House, which serves as a national library housing the Kim family's masterworks. The Grand People's Study House also features an extensive amount of study space and classrooms where real instruction actually does take place. And we were given a full tour of the interior, which is quite ornate and whose architecture matches many of the city's other communist monuments and naturally includes a statue of Kim Il-sung. But our visit also included an obligatory stop at the desk where they loan out books, as well as classroom facilities, some of which are devoted to English language learning. The USS Pueblo was a U.S. spy ship that was seized by the North Korean military after a short skirmish in 1968. And that led to the capture and imprisonment over the course of 11 months of 83 U.S. soldiers. And it was only following an official apology from the American government that led to the release of the GIs. But the North Koreans elected to keep the ship moored on the banks of the Taedong River as a kind of trophy in its never-ending war against its mortal imperialist enemy, the United States. And today, it is a tourist attraction. And you enter the ship, you watch a short video, and then you are led on a guided tour of the ship, which contains much of the original equipment and damage that was sustained during its capture in 1968. A female soldier led us on the tour and permitted me to take her portrait. A visit to the USS Pueblo is usually followed by the victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum, which is devoted to documenting the alleged atrocities committed by the United States military during the 3-year Korean War between the North and the South that ultimately saw the intervention of both the United States and China. We were led on our tour by a stern, somber female docent who has been leading these tours for many years and had become a sort of YouTube star through her appearance in many tourist videos. The official North Korean account, and the basis for much state propaganda, accuses the United States of starting the Korean War via a preemptive attack from the South. The alternative history is, of course, challenged by nearly any history book ever written. But the museum's crowning attraction is a rotating diorama that depicts American soldiers falling in defeat and surrendering in shame to the victorious North Korean forces. Our North Korea trip also included several excursions to sites outside of Pyongyang. And although once the government minders realized that I was an avid photographer, they posted a guide next to me at all times, I still managed to snap quite a few photos of the North Korean countryside. And these are the sort of photos that most vacationers would be well advised not to take, and that might land a tourist in jail if taken in today's quite tense political climate. These photographs depict a life that stands diametrically opposed to that of the showcase capital of Pyongyang. We're talking about a countryside in which millions of North Koreans live in abject poverty on a scale unimaginable in even developing countries. Of course, we were shielded from the concentration camps that house many thousands of North Korea's political prisoners, or the villages in which millions had lost their lives in a succession of horrible famines in the 1990s. But I think my photos nonetheless managed to capture everyday life in North Korea, and I am very fortunate to have escaped the country with all of these images intact. Had I visited later, it is certainly possible that my audacity could have led to my detainment or worse. Here are my images. In our travels outside the capital, we saw many sights, and among those sights was Mhohyang-san, the so-called, quote, mysterious fragrant mountain, which included a stop at the allegedly famous falls. This also included a visit to the International Friendship Exhibition. Now, the International Friendship Exhibition is a building devoted to gifts that the ruling Kim family has received over the years from dignitaries and celebrities, which even includes a signed basketball from Michael Jordan. And although the museum itself was rather unremarkable and typical of other monuments to the Kim dynasty that we saw, we encountered a group of North Korean children who had clearly never, ever before seen a camera and were fascinated by the sight of Western tourists and seeing their own faces instantly appear on an LCD screen of a digital camera. In my opinion, it's these kinds of heartwarming encounters with everyday North Koreans that hold the ultimate key to someday liberating the people and reuniting the two Koreas. We also toured the traditional Phohyon Temple, which was built in the 11th century, and our guide was dressed in a traditional hanbok, and she regaled us with the legends of the Joseon dynasty as we enjoyed the relative serenity of the grounds of the temple. One of the most impactful experiences was our journey to the demilitarized zone that separates the two Koreas. On our journey south, we actually stopped near the border in Kaesong, which is known for its rare industrial partnership with South Korea, and as you'll see, its wide, carless boulevards. The streets were filled with scenes of surprising poverty. We saw belligerent goats, we saw children in tattered clothing. The contrast could not have been greater with Pyongyang, where appearances were certainly more carefully maintained. This was poverty on a different scale. After we visited Kaesong, we continued making our way south, and we were subjected to a series of military checkpoints and heavier layers of security until we finally stopped just short of Panmunjom, known as the Peace Village in the DMZ. We were met there by a North Korean military officer, which, based on his uniform, he was a high-ranking lieutenant colonel. It was here that I captured one of my most iconic images, which was that of a young North Korean soldier likely seeing Americans in the flesh for the first time. We were then ushered into a room where a diorama depicting the Peace Village was on display. After that, we were taken on a tour of the North Korean Peace Museum, where the original armistice documents are stored. Finally, we reached the Joint Security Area, which is comprised of a row of buildings that you've undoubtedly seen on television, where North and South Korean soldiers exchange these menacing stares across a dividing line that represents the border between North and South. There were no South Korean soldiers present that day, but the North Korean army took their customary positions for a photo op, which we obliged. We were then ushered into the conference room that straddles the line between the North and the South, and where one can momentarily cross the border into South Korea. But there were two soldiers standing guard at the door beyond which lay the free world. I recall vividly how odd it felt to stand with one foot in the world's most oppressive dictatorship and the other in the south, only steps, yet a seemingly impossible distance away from a world of neon lights and unfettered capitalism where thousands of my countrymen lay ready at a moment's notice to defend our way of life. And as we stood atop the balcony in Panmunjom, and I peered through my telephoto lens into the south, I remember seeing an American soldier stationed on a watchtower just beyond the Freedom House Pagoda in the south. And he was clearly observing us quite intently through his binoculars. When he realized he'd been noticed, he waved, and we all waved back. We were in the presence of North Korean officers at that time, but it was a natural reaction. And I only remember thinking that that could very well have started World War III. We spent the rest of our time in Pyongyang, which is certainly a symbol of tyranny, but it's also filled with everyday North Koreans who dream the same dreams as the freer peoples of this world. And there were already hints of self-expression and a will to move forward. At the end of the day, Pyongyang has a great deal in common with any other city of the world. The food offered to tourists in the DPRK is bountiful and delicious, but it's all part of the show to combat this image of North Korea as a poverty-stricken hell. We ate everything from bulgogi and kimchi to duck and cold noodles and even draft beer. Our food was varied and abundant, but it is important to remember that the average North Korean citizen can't even afford to buy a bag of rice. One final thing to note is that a film crew followed us and documented our every move, which I assume is standard for any North Korean tour. They cut together the clips into a movie that serves as a sort of cross between a standard vacation video and a piece of communist propaganda. But on the final night of our stay in the DPRK, the state videographers premiered their film, and I've posted a copy of their video on YouTube. After a long, disorienting trip to the Hermit Kingdom, we departed North Korea just as we'd come, on that tarmac at the Pyongyang airport. We were thankful to enjoy the relative freedom of the People's Republic of China when we finally landed in Beijing. It was a vacation to end all vacations, and I hope you've enjoyed the photos and the commentary. Until next time, Marsh W13 signing off.